Drinking wine and beer all the week. Time for whiskey on a Sunday. So you are all very welcome here tonight as I start my brand new online series, Whiskey on a Sunday. So each week at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time-ish, I will be mostly live to chat with an adult audience about some whiskey history, what's new in the world of whiskey, as well as to do a live tasting, or two, or three, and in my opinion, more importantly, to share the story of what's in my glass. Now, as this series is indeed intended for adults, please, if you are not legally able to purchase and consume alcohol where you live, then you need to sign off. For the rest of you grown-ups, now that you know what I will be doing, here's a few important notes about what I will not be doing during this series. Through Whiskey on a Sunday, I will not be telling you what you should buy, what you should drink, nor will I be grading or assigning any points to the whiskeys I taste and talk about. You know, these are actually the key reasons that I started this series. Well, those and my deep appreciation for whiskeys in general. So no point system, no pretentious blathering about why you must or must not buy something. I also will not tell you if a whiskey is good or bad. So yes, I am an accredited sommelier with designations from the globally recognized Wine Spirits Education Trust, and I do have a trained palate. And yes, as such, I am indeed qualified to assess and break down the technical aspects of wine, beer, spirits, and sake. But here's the thing. I really don't believe that most folks out there, folks like yourselves, I don't believe that you really enjoy or are even really looking for technical notes filled with industry buzzwords and jargon that we use, as professionals in the industry. Nor, in my opinion, should every whiskey review be about assigning good or bad points or about giving a score level. And here's why. On a technical note, there is basis to evaluate whiskey with regards to how true the whiskey is to the style that is trying to be achieved, how well it adheres to the laws and regulations of where it's being made, etc., etc., etc. But folks, in my opinion, unless you're really an uber whiskey enthusiast, that kind of talk can get more than a little bit dry and, frankly, more than a little bit boring. As for whether a whiskey is good or bad, or whether it deserves 50 points or 100 points, well, truthfully, my opinion for the general public, that's more than fairly subjective. We all like certain aromas and flavor profiles more than others. And as such, we're going to like different things and we're going to dislike things. Sure, yes, we are going to like some of the same things, no doubt about it. But for example, if I love the smell of and taste of vanilla, there's an aspect found in whiskeys. So I find a whiskey that has a lot of vanilla in it. I love the smell and taste of vanilla, but let's say you hate it. It does absolutely no good for me to tell you that whiskey brand X, which has tons of vanilla notes, is an excellent whiskey, it's worth 99 points, and that you should buy it. Because if you don't like vanilla, you're not going to like the whiskey. No matter what I say. Period. End of story. And you know what? That's okay. That's more than fair. You see, I tell all my clients, regardless of the product, there's no such thing as bad wine, bad beer, bad spirits, bad sake. If you, my client, or in this case viewer, the end user, if you like it, it's not bad if you like it. Certainly there's better expressions and styles. There's more honest and artisanal production methods that can be used in making them. But really, folks, at the end of the day, you like what you like, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. My goal with Whiskey on a Sunday is to maybe demystify whiskey a little bit for you, to enlighten you a little bit as to how different parts of the world are producing very different styles and taking different approaches, and also to share what I'm tasting along with the backstory of what's in the glass. Oh, and of course, hopefully to have a little fun with you all while we do it as well. So with regards to this series, please note it's all educational and it's all informative. I am not affiliated at least not yet, with any of the products that I'll be showcasing, nor have I been paid to talk about any of them. Some of the products that you're going to see over the weeks and months, hopefully, as we continue with this, some of them are going to come from my own private collection. Others, will have been graciously donated. If and when anything to that effect changes, if I become affiliated with anything or what have you, I will be very upfront and I'm going to let everybody know right away. So, okay, all that being said, let's formally begin Whiskey on a Sunday. And I'm going to ask the question, what is whiskey? Any thoughts? I can hear virtual gears turning in brains across the spectrum. So by definition, whiskey is a strictly regulated spirit worldwide with many classes and types, with the typical unifying characteristics of all those different classes being fermentation of grains, the distillation of those grains, and then aging of the product in wooden barrels. I mean, that's a pretty top line, pretty simple analysis, but that's essentially what it is. And we'll get more into more details as the weeks go on, but that's what it is. So what about the spelling of whiskey? Because some of you will notice that I use the EY spelling. There's whiskey, K-E-Y, and then there's whiskey with a K-Y. So anybody out there, put your hand up, shout really, open a window, shout really loud if you know what's up with that. Why is there two spellings of whiskey? Executive producer, anybody chiming in? Okay, very good. Executive producer, hard at work tonight, folks. So kudos to anybody that may have been a little shy to type it in, but that knew that the K-E-Y comes from Dublin area distillers way back in the day that thought themselves superior, producing superior whiskeys than the rest of the Irish folk that were making whiskey at the time. This is back in the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s. So they thought, our whiskey is better. We're making it in Dublin. We have to differentiate from what's being produced elsewhere by the commoners. So they added what I consider a somewhat pretentious E to the name. And so whiskey with a K-E-Y was then known as being produced in Dublin by quote-unquote high-end distillers, and whiskey with just a K-Y was just whiskey. Eventually, over time, the K-E-Y just kind of became synonymous with Irish whiskey, period. Although it's not a law that, you don't legally have to spell Irish whiskey with K-E-Y. And there's other distillers throughout the world, Canada and the US, where I know and I've seen that they have adopted the K-E-Y as well. So there you go. That's that myth has now been debunked. So let's talk about how whiskey all started. And we'll touch on some key major influences. We're kind of laying the foundation here for Whiskey on a Sunday. Would it surprise you to know that it actually kind of all started with early Persians who practiced distilling as early as about 600 AD for medicinal purposes, using terracotta type stills that they made themselves. By the Dark Ages, the church had monasteries making what was then called Ishkabaha. In 1530, Henry VIII, he influenced whiskey making as he dissolved the Catholic Church when he wanted a divorce and they wouldn't give him one. And so when he dissolved the Catholic Church, all the church lands and the church themselves, they became part of the state. And all the priests and the clerics and all the monks, well, they were kind of kicked out and they became common folk. But you see, as I said earlier, they're the ones that had that knowledge of how to distill the Ishkabaha, or the water of life. So when they became private citizens, they in turn passed on that distillation experience onto the common person. And so there you go, Henry VIII, who would have thought? When we're talking about making whiskey, it can get kind of deep and whatever, but making whiskey essentially starts with grain. And, we're going to take a deeper dive into whiskey production in future episodes. But let's just spend a few moments right now talking about grain, because that's a key component to it. There's 4 main types of grain when you make whiskey: barley, corn, rye, and wheat. Depending on where it's made and the style that you're trying to make, different grains are used either alone or they're used together. Barley is used a lot. It's hardy, it's versatile, it tends to give off those toasty, toffee sweet notes that we find in a lot of whiskeys. Corn, high in starch, Starch is important in grains because starches get turned into sugar when we add yeast. That's how we make alcohol. So corn, very high in starch, a lot of sugar content, very easy to grow. Corn tends to give big and full notes of sweetness, again, high in starch. And it also tends to leave whiskeys with vanilla notes, maple syrup type notes, and it also feels a little heavy and fat in your mouth. Rye, popular in North America. It can be difficult to work with though. It's got a thick seed casing that tends to gum up machineries, so you don't see a lot of it being used in great bulk. It does add a spicy note to whiskeys though, so the tip of your tongue, if you've ever had a whiskey and just the tip of your tongue is tingling, there's probably a little bit or a lot of rye in that whiskey. And then there's wheat, generally used when corn and barley is not available, and it tends to give off cereal and in some cases some honey type notes. So those are the grains. That's kind of, pretty much that's what's used in traditional whiskey. Now whiskey also needs to be aged. That's a very important factor. And it needs to be aged and matured in wooden casks in order to be classified as a whiskey. Quick explanation on wood barrels is that the wood allows the whiskey to breathe because the wood is actually a little bit porous. It's watertight, but it allows the air to get in and out. And that allows the whiskey to continue to develop and to mellow out over time. Two very popular styles of whiskey barrels that are used. You see ex-bourbon barrels are used by different producers, and ex-sherry casks. We'll talk about barrels again more in depth in future episodes, but essentially using ex-bourbon barrels tends to lead flavors of vanilla to the whiskey, some creme brulee, pine, mint, even some coconut at times. And when you use ex-sherry casks, you tend to get more dried fruit, clove, baking spice, incense, or walnut, nutty notes in there. So just top line stuff as to the type of barrels being used and why. Okay, time to get some specific. So as you can see, hopefully, beside me is a bottle of Jameson Irish whiskey. And I thought it's a great choice for the first episode of Whiskey on a Sunday for a few reasons, with the most important fact being it's Irish. You see, the Irish, or more specifically the Irish monks, I talked a little bit earlier about the monks and the priests and how they were important. It was those Irish monks that used to travel the European continent a lot. And around the 12th century, they were out and about and they discovered what the early Persians were up to and saw that they had developed this technique of distilling botanicals to make a perfume. That's what they were doing. It was for perfumes. And then those monks brought back that distillation knowledge with them to the Emerald Isle. Now, being the inventive and very creative-minded folk that the Irish are, it didn't take these monks long to modify that technique and to subsequently produce Ishkabaha, and that's where that name comes from. It's Old Gaelic for water of life, or as we know it today, booze. Back then, the Ishkabaha would not have been aged at all. Casks and wooden barrels, it wasn't used back then. Those monks would have also thrown in things like herbs, and it would have been a fairly effective form of medicine, apparently. We wouldn't recommend that today. More often than not, it was a more effective form of liquid courage to get the soldiers ready for battle. So, the term Ishkabaha, like I said, early Gaelic for water of life. However, over the years, the term kind of became anglicized, eventually leading to the Ishka turning into whiskey, and the Baha part, that just got dropped, period. So, Ishkabaha became whiskey. I do find it a little interesting, I'll be honest, a little funny, that the term became anglicized because originally the English, who came to occupy Ireland, we all know about that, the English didn't like the Ishkabaha or the whiskey. They found it very uninteresting. They had no use for it. And when they occupied Ireland, they decided, we're just going to ban the production of this. We'll give a few people royal license, or special permission to produce it, maybe. But overall, no, the production of whiskey was banned by the British. The Irish, being the Irish, pretty much paid no attention to the British order whatsoever. They continued to make whiskey throughout the countryside, regardless of what the English thought. So much so that the British Crown eventually decided to try and at least profit from what the Irish were doing with it, and the British decided to create excise laws, or essentially taxation laws. They tried several different versions of laws. What came out, nothing seemed to work. But a law passed in 1759 had an interesting and unintended effect. That law resulted in a tax being applied to malt, along with the grains, so when they're malting the grains, along with potatoes and sugar that were also being used in whiskey production at the time. But the taxation on malt, made it expensive to produce whiskey. So, again, the Irish being as inventive as they are, that led them to discover that they could still make a very good tasting whiskey with only 40% malted barley being inside. So what does that mean? Well, simple math. That means that the Irish could then make a whiskey with only paying for up to 40% tax, depending on how much they wanted to use, but they could put 60% of unmalted barley into the mix and it would still taste very, very good. Clever those folks, clever the Irish, very inventive nation. So that's why sometimes you see on bottles malted and unmalted barley. That tradition still continues today, regardless of modern taxation rules. But that's kind of where the unmalted part first came in, 1759. So after all this taxation and trying to tax it at source and all that good stuff, eventually the English just kind of gave up trying to quash whiskey production, and instead they made changes so that whiskey production in Ireland could be legal for everybody, with taxes paid upon the sale of the whiskey. So that was a game changer. That caused Irish whiskey production to boom. It propelled Ireland to being the largest spirit producing region in the world. So much so that by 1878, Irish whiskey was worth 25% more than Scottish whiskey or any other whiskeys being produced, much to the chagrin of a lot of Scotsmen who were, kind of adapting to the whiskey campaign, and they weren't too happy about that. They tried to get a little ingenious, but we'll get into that in later episodes. So Irish whiskey was all the rage in the 19th century, but sadly, in the 20th century, we'd see the whole thing come crashing down. More on that, again, later episodes. So much to talk about. But that's what happened. The Irish whiskey went kaboom, worldwide demand. So I thought that then should lead us all to tasting an Irish whiskey for episode 1. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start with an Irish whiskey. Why not start with the most recognized Irish whiskey brand in the world? Jameson. So I'm sure now even you guys are getting a little bit thirsty out there. I'm getting a little parched but before we dive into the tasting, I'm going to pour out a little bit into my glass, and I'm going to take a moment or two, and we're going to talk a little bit about Jameson and the backstory of John Jameson I. So before we do that, hopefully this comes through. We're going to take a quick peek at the label. I'm going to hold that up. So a couple of things on the label. It boasts the year 1780. That's a little interesting. 1780 is not when Jameson Distillery was founded. It's actually the year in which the Bow Street Distillery was founded. That was a distillery that Jameson eventually bought, but he did not build it. But that's the date of that. There's also the Jameson coat of arms and the words Shine Etsu on there. If you've ever wondered what that is, that's the family motto, Jameson family motto, which means without fear. And apparently it goes back to the 1500s when the Jameson clan used to fight pirates. Now, earlier today, I did a teaser and a reminder that I was doing this tonight, and I posted a picture saying, what do these 4 things have to do with Jameson Irish whiskey? Well, now we know what the pirate symbol is. This goes back to Jameson clan, the 1500s, taking on pirates. So there you go. Now you know. Now in the same post, I also included these 3 other images, and I promised to explain how they all tied back to today's first episode as well. So let's chat about the flag of Scotland. Would it surprise any of you to learn that John Jameson I was a Scotsman himself? He was born in Alloa, Scotland, which is northeast of Glasgow. John was initially a lawyer who married a woman by the name of Margaret Haig, whose family were established whiskey distillers and bonders in Scotland themselves. The Haigs were producing Ballantines and Buchanans amongst their brands. Oh, I think the lab's coming in for a visit. So in the middle 30s, John Jameson found himself living in Dublin, and in 1786 became the general manager of the Bow Street Distillery, so 1780. He found himself the general manager of that facility, which was a facility, by the way, that his wife's cousins had actually built back in 1780. In 1805, John bought the distillery himself. He bought it outright, and then in 1810 he renamed it John Jameson and Son Distillery because his son, John Jameson II, had come to work with him. John Jameson II ran the company, the distillery, and eventually turned the reins over to his own son, John Jameson III. I know what you're thinking, that's a lot of Johns. And then just in case you're curious, John and Margaret did have a very big family, John I and his wife Margaret. They had 16 children in total, 4 boys, 4 girls. Their 4th son was named Andrew, because they just wanted to change things up a little. Andrew also went into the whiskey business, running a small distillery in Enniscorthy, County Wexford. However, what Andrew is most known for relates to the 3rd image that I have here, and that's the original telegraph. You see, Andrew was the grandfather of Eugenio Marconi, who invented the telegraph. And it's not really much of a stretch when you go from inventing the telegraph to, 150 plus years later, technologies that have been based on that lead us to the iPhone, which is the 4th image I have here. And that's what I'm using. I'm using an iPhone 10 to record and broadcast this series here with you guys tonight. But again, without Marconi, I don't think we'd have the iPhone. Without Marconi, we wouldn't have the iPhone, and without Jameson, we wouldn't have Marconi. So there you go. That's how those 4 things all tie back to John Jameson. Okay? Knowledge is power. Pretty cool. Doesn't really have a lot to do with whiskey, but pretty cool nonetheless. Okay, so back to Jameson. So sons and sons and sons ran the company. In 1966, Jameson became part of a group called Irish Distillers. And we're going to talk about why, because that's a whole other ball of wax on its own. But they joined Irish Distillers Group in 1966, and then subsequently became part of the big French drink consortium Pernod Ricard when Pernod Ricard in 1988 bought Irish Distillers Group. So lots of momentum going off, but they've kept the name Jameson on the bottles, of course. All right, so great history, Paul, but what about the whiskey? All right, I'm getting thirsty, so let's dive in. The whiskey itself, Jameson, the original John Jameson blend here, it's triple distilled, a blend as I just said, of both pot still and column still grains. Interesting to note that the recipe that we have today was actually reworked in 1972 to appeal to changing tastes worldwide. The whiskey was more heavy before that. So they decided to reinvent whiskey into a lighter style, which was what the world was yearning for at the time. And they use grain as a secret weapon. That's what they call it. Using grain as a secret weapon. So, the recipe is a bit complex. The pot still portion is itself a blend of both malted and unmalted barley, about 50-50. And then we have column still column still portion of grain that's also in here. And that's mixed somewhere around 20% unmalted barley and 80% corn-ish. And it's these secret blends or these secret percentages that Jameson claimed to be their secret weapon on the whiskey front. Interesting also to note that all ingredients current day are sourced within a 50-mile radius of the Cork distillery where Jameson is now made, which fits into this grain to glass profile and an approach that many whiskey producers in Ireland and across the world are doing. And again, that's a great topic that we'll dive into when we get into some of the other whiskeys that we're going to taste. So all in all, pretty complex and technical for the world's #1 selling Irish whiskey that sits on bar rails in over 130 countries and likely counting. And that's a good point I want to make. Just because it's on bar rails, it's just on the rails of the bars, and it's usually pretty affordable, it doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that the aroma or the flavor profile is poor or bland. So just let's keep that in mind. So I've teased and I've talked long enough now, so let's give it a go, shall we? Let's dive in. So right away, I'm not sure how well it's going to come through, but right away, we see it's got a bit of a golden amber hue. Very appealing color, but I want everyone to keep in mind, this is a young whiskey. It's no more than 4 years old, according to Jameson. Well, they say it's 4 years old. It's probably 4 years plus a day. So really young. And to achieve color like this, there's a coloring agent that's been added. It's called E150A, E150A. Now, you don't have to get upset about that. You don't have to get all excited about that. E15A is odorless, it's tasteless, and it's a very, very popular agent that's used mainly in younger whiskeys throughout the world. And it's also permitted by law in Ireland. Along with having to be aged a minimum of 3 years and being produced on the island of Ireland, E150A is totally legit under the Irish laws for whiskey. So they can do this, not a problem, but it's good to know. Normally something like this, depth of color we would see with longer term aging, and that's likely what they're trying to do, make it look a little more appealing. Okay, so now I've let my Jameson sit for several minutes. You saw me pour it earlier, and I do this on purpose with Jameson. Because it's a young whiskey, I find that giving it a few minutes to breathe and settle down a bit and open up does it a bit of good. So, on the nose, off the top, I'm getting yellow apple, honey, cereal grain, hay, some grass, some white flowers, some floral notes, some baked biscuit, lemon citrus, some butter, some cream. And just a little hint of baking spice, like nutmeg, cinnamon. There's a lot going on in the nose. Again, that's what I'm saying. Because it's on the bar rail does not mean that this is a boring whiskey. There's a lot going on in the nose alone. Okay, on the palate, let's have a little taste here. And when I taste whiskeys or anything, I swish everything around. So I want to coat my entire mouth to get all of my flavor receptors firing. Okay, not going to lie. There's a bit of bite with this. It's a young whiskey. As such, like I said before, it hasn't benefited from the mellowing factor that, long-term oak aging has, where it kind of smooths things out and lets flavors come together a little more harmoniously. Nothing wrong with this, but it's a little sharp. Okay, let's go in for a second sip. Yeah, it's not as sharp on the second sip. Palate's calibrated. Okay, so, pardon me, yellow apple, green apple, honey, cereal, walnut, almond, that nuttiness, buttercream, custard. I'm getting some notes of vanilla and toffee. There's a touch of heat, and it's not alcoholic heat because it's only 40% ABV, so this isn't a big boozy thing, but the little heat, it's almost like cumin. And I'm getting a little of that baking spice, a little of that nutmeg, cinnamon going on, and I'm getting a little bit of dried fruit. Yeah, a little fig, a little dried raisin, dried fig. So, again, on the palate, there's a lot going on in this bottle, this glass. Casks that are used to produce this are a mix of both ex-bourbon and ex-sherry, so it's actually a mix of those. And that kind of helps lend into those vanilla and toffee notes I talked about earlier, and then the dried fruit likely coming from the sherry cask. Overall, I like it. I'm not saying you will, but overall, I like it. And I can easily see why it's so popular. Now, it's triple distilled, as I said before, and that keeps it light. There's lots of aromas in here and lots of flavors that likely please a lot of people's palates, all while being good value. Here in Ontario, Canada that is, 750 milliliter bottle, it retails for $36.95 at our provincial liquor board, the LCBO, Liquor Control Board of Ontario. For my American friends and my American viewers, by saying a provincially run store, that's the same as your state-run liquor stores. Although the big difference here in Ontario is that we don't have any private retailers. We can only buy from our quote-unquote state retailer. But that's what's meant by provincial stores. Okay, so how do I enjoy drinking my Jameson normally? Well, for the most part, with any whiskey, to be quite honest, my preference is to drink it neat. Occasionally with some of the more robust or heavy or more fuller bodied or peated whiskeys, I may add a drop or two of water, not really any more than that, but just a drop or two. And that's going to change. Adding water to it can change the aroma profiles, the flavors, and it can change some of the depth of complexity of a whiskey. But I find that doesn't really work with Irish whiskeys. They're, in my opinion, my experience, Irish whiskeys are light. Again, most are triple distilled. They don't have to be. Not all of them are, but most of them are. And by virtue of being so light already, when you add water to it, it just kind of makes them flat and boring, and you lose so much flavor and aroma profile. Just doesn't seemingly, in my experience, doesn't seemingly bring anything to the table. So I like them neat. I'm also not a fan of adding sugary mixes to my Jameson. I guess you could say I'm a bit of a purist. This said, though, occasionally, however, I do enjoy a Jameson with ginger and lime. Adding 1 part of Jameson, 1 part of Jameson, 3 parts of ginger ale, quality ginger ale, with a squeeze of lime, it can be a little refreshing. I do enjoy that. Speaking of ginger ale, did you know ginger ale was invented in Belfast by Thomas Joseph Cantrell? So there you go, ginger ale. Product of Ireland. Eh? No wonder it works well with Jameson. See, the Irish, I'm telling you. Irish, they know what's going on over there. Okay, folks, so tonight we've learned that the Irish invented whiskey. They've thumbed their nose to the English in attempts to quash whiskey production, and eventually not only got England to bless the production of whiskey, but that the Irish then, well, for a good period of time, ruled the world with their legally produced product, at least for a little while. And people wonder why the world loves the Irish. Well, that wraps up the inaugural episode of Whiskey on a Sunday with Somm4All. I do hope you've enjoyed our time together. I look forward to chatting with you all again next week. Next Sunday, I'll be sharing more Irish whiskey history, and I'll be taking a trek up to the north of Ireland for a taste of Bushmills Irish whiskey, as well as a taste of Dunville's Three Crowns. So I want to thank Cork Wines and Whiskies for the sample of Dunville's. They've supplied me with a few tasty samples that we'll enjoy together over the next few weeks. So that's next week. We're going up to the north. A quick reminder as well that you can book your own private virtual guided tastings by me, Somm4All, for whiskey, for beer, wine, any other spirits that are out there, as well as sake. Thanks to the internet and modern technology, no matter where you are in the world, Canada, the US, abroad, we can get together virtually. I can do some guided tastings with you. It can be done safely, conveniently, and it can be enjoyed in the confines of your own home. So for more information and or to book your session, drop me an email, paul@somm4all.com. These events add a unique element to group and corporate tastings alike. And truthfully, they also make a pretty neat and unique Christmas gift, and that can be tailored to whoever the recipient is on your list. So, just say it. paul@somm4all.com. Be happy to answer any questions. Until next week, folks, Thank you all again for joining me. Be safe, be well out there. Sláinte from Somm4All.